My mother didn't abandon me on a highway. She bought me a one-way ticket at age 9, left me alone at the airport, then vanished, without a trace. 24 years later, she walked into my billion-dollar IPO roadshow, smiled at my investors, and called herself my loving mother. She had no idea I had been watching her for 2 years, and I had been waiting for exactly this moment. There are moments in your life that split everything into before and after. Most people do not recognize them until years later, standing in the quiet of some ordinary Tuesday morning, coffee in hand, wondering exactly when the ground shifted beneath their feet. I recognized mine the second it happened. I was 9 years old, and I watched my mother walk away from me inside the departure terminal of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport without once looking back. It was a Thursday in late October, the kind of gray southern morning where the sky sits low and heavy like a wool blanket pressed against the city. The airport smelled the way it always did, like recycled air and fast food, and the particular anxious energy of people moving in every direction at once. Announcements crackled over the intercom. Rolling suitcases clicked against the polished floors. Families rushed past in clusters, pulling children by the hand, checking screens, arguing over gate numbers. I stood completely still in the middle of all of it. My mother, Vivian, had always been a woman who moved through the world like she was the most important person in any room she entered. She was tall and sharp-featured, with the kind of beauty that demanded attention, and the kind of coldness that made you wish it did not. That morning, she was wearing a cream-colored blouse and carrying the leather handbag she never let anyone touch. She set my small vinyl suitcase down on the tile floor with the efficient, distracted energy of someone dropping off dry cleaning. Then she crouched down to my level, took a folded piece of paper from inside her coat, and pressed it into my hand. A plane ticket, one way, destination my grandmother's house in Savannah. "Someone will come get you," she said. Her voice was flat and already somewhere else entirely. She straightened up, smoothed the front of her blouse, and without another word, without a hug, without even a backward glance, she walked through the sliding glass doors and stepped into a waiting taxi that folded her into its dark interior and carried her away. Just like that, she was gone. I did not move for a long moment. I held the ticket in both hands and stared at the space where she had been standing, half expecting her to reappear, to laugh and say she was joking, to reach down and take my hand and tell me we were going somewhere together. The glass doors stayed closed. The taxi did not come back. Somewhere behind me, through the long wall of windows, overlooking the departure lane, I caught a glimpse of my older brother watching from the back seat of the same taxi. Brandon was 12, that year old enough to understand exactly what was happening, young enough that he did not yet know what to do with that understanding. His face was pressed close to the glass. His expression was something I would spend years trying to find the right word for. Not cruelty, not indifference. Something closer to anguish, wrapped in helplessness, the look of a boy who wanted to do something and could not make his body move. The taxi merged into traffic. The window where his face had been went dark. And then I was truly alone. The terminal moved around me like a river moves around a stone. Travelers streamed past on both sides, wheeling luggage, talking into phones, living the ordinary busy textures of their own lives. No one stopped. No one looked at the small girl standing by herself, with a suitcase too big for her arms and a ticket she barely understood. I was invisible in the way that children become invisible when adults decide not to see them. I looked down at the ticket in my hand. The paper was slightly warm from being inside my mother's coat. I read my name printed across the top in clean block letters. I read the departure time. I read the gate number. I folded it carefully and held it against my chest like it was something that mattered, because in that moment, it was the only solid thing I had. I did not cry. This was not bravery. I want to be honest about that. It was something closer to a kind of internal stillness that arrived when my mind simply could not process the full weight of what had just happened. The tears would come later in private, in the small bedroom at my grandmother's house, where I would press my face into a pillow and shake without making a sound. But not here. Not in the middle of this airport where strangers were rushing past, and the intercom was announcing departures, and the world was continuing on as though nothing of any importance had occurred. An hour passed, maybe more. Then a woman's voice cut through the noise, warm and slightly breathless, calling my name. I turned to find my grandmother Ruth moving through the crowd toward me with the determined stride of a woman who had driven 2.5 hours without stopping, because someone she loved needed her. Ruth was a compact, sturdy woman in her early 60s, with silver-streaked hair and reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead. She was still wearing her gardening shoes. She had left the house in a hurry. She did not ask questions. She did not say anything about my mother or explain how she knew where I was. She simply arrived, wrapped both arms around me, held on with the particular fierce gentleness of someone who understood that words were not the right tool for this moment, and then picked up my suitcase with one hand and took my hand with her other and walked us both toward the exit. I let her lead me out of the terminal and into the cold October air. I kept the ticket folded in my fist the entire way to her car. I did not cry that day. I simply looked down at the ticket in my hand and made myself a promise. Someday, I would be the one holding all the cards. 24 years is a long time to build something from nothing. It is long enough to forget what hunger feels like, and then remember, and then decide that remembering is exactly what keeps you sharp. The temporary offices Monroe FinTech had leased on the 31st floor of a glass tower in Brickell looked nothing like the kind of place where a 9-year-old girl with a vinyl suitcase and a one-way ticket would ever have imagined ending up. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Miami skyline in every direction. Biscayne Bay stretched out to the east flat and silver in the late afternoon light. The furniture was clean-lined and expensive. The air smelled like fresh coffee and new carpet, and the particular electric tension of something large that was about to happen. 3 days. That was all that stood between Monroe FinTech and the New York Stock Exchange opening bell. I was 33 years old, and I had built this company with my own hands over the course of 8 years. Monroe FinTech specialized in financial technology infrastructure for underserved communities, the kind of banking solutions that large institutions had spent decades deciding were not profitable enough to bother with. We had proven them wrong in ways that apparently surprised everyone except me. The upcoming listing on the exchange was not just a business milestone. It was the loudest possible answer to every person who had ever looked at me and seen someone not worth the trouble. The office that afternoon had the controlled chaos of a campaign headquarters 3 days before an election. My core team moved between workstations with the focused urgency of people who had not slept properly in 2 weeks and had chosen to treat that as a badge of honor. Laptops were open everywhere. Whiteboards were covered in numbers. Someone had taped a printed countdown to the refrigerator in the small kitchen off the main floor. Someone else had brought in a box of Cuban pastries from the place on 8th Street and left it open on the conference table, where it was being slowly destroyed by people who kept insisting they were too stressed to eat. Marcus Webb, my chief of staff, and the person most responsible for keeping the operational machinery of this company running on schedule, appeared at my office doorway with a tablet in one hand and a look on his face that I had come to recognize as his version of controlled alarm. Marcus was a meticulous, even-tempered man in his late 30s who had been with Monroe FinTech for 5 years, and he expressed stress the way a swan moved across water, completely composed on the surface, working very hard underneath. "The Carlyle Group confirmed their position this morning," he said, stepping inside and pulling up the figures on his screen. "We are sitting at 93% of our target allocation. The remaining 7% is still soft, 2 funds that want to see the final roadshow presentation before they commit." He paused. "We need tomorrow to go perfectly. Tomorrow will go perfectly, I said. I meant it. Before Marcus could respond, a knock at the open door drew both of our attention. Eleanor Ross did not wait to be formally invited in, because Eleanor Ross had never waited for a formal invitation to anything in her 71 years on this earth. She was a tall, white-haired woman with the posture of someone who had spent decades commanding rooms, and the sharp, assessing eyes of someone who had made a considerable fortune by trusting those instincts absolutely. She was the founding partner of Ross Capital, one of the most respected venture firms on the East Coast, and she had been Monroe FinTech's most significant early investor for the better part of 8 years. She was also in every way that actually counted the most steadying presence I had in my professional life. The Hendricks family office called me directly, Eleanor said, settling into the chair across from my desk with the unhurried ease of someone who owned whatever room she happened to be sitting in. They are nervous about the timing. I told them what I always tell nervous investors. She picked up her coffee cup from the edge of my desk without asking. That the founder of this company has never once given me a reason to doubt her. That tends to settle people down. Does it work? Marcus asked. It has so far. She looked at me over the rim of the cup with an expression I could not entirely read. Something attentive and quiet. The way you might watch a chess player make a move you had anticipated several turns earlier. Then she set the cup down and stood. I will see you both at the roadshow tomorrow. Do not be late. She left the way she had arrived without ceremony. Marcus watched her go and then turned back to me with slightly raised eyebrows. She does know how to make an exit. It is one of her better qualities, I said. He left me with the updated allocation report, which I did not immediately read. Instead, I sat for a moment in the quiet that followed and looked out through the glass at the city below. Miami, in late afternoon, had a particular quality of light, warm and slightly hazy, turning the bay into something that looked painted rather than real. I had chosen this city deliberately for the roadshow. There was something fitting about it beginning the final chapter in a place that understood reinvention. My phone buzzed once on the desk beside me. A message from a contact saved under a string of numbers rather than a name. The man behind that number was James Okafor, a private investigator based out of Atlanta, who had been working for me quietly and carefully for the past 2 years. His messages were always brief. This one was no different. Packages moving, ETA tomorrow. I read it twice. Then, I set the phone face down on the desk, turned my chair toward the window, and looked out at the Miami skyline as the last of the afternoon light dissolved into the first pale suggestion of evening. She was coming, and I had been ready for exactly this moment. The Four Seasons. Brickell knew how to make money feel comfortable. That was, I had come to understand the entire purpose of a place like this. The lobby moved with the particular choreography of serious wealth at ease marble floors, reflecting the warm glow of pendant lights, staff appearing and disappearing with the silent efficiency of people trained to anticipate needs before they were spoken. The pre-IPO roadshow reception occupied the hotel's main ballroom, and by 4 in the afternoon, it had filled with exactly the kind of people who made decisions that moved markets. I worked the room the way I had learned to work every room methodically and with genuine attention. There is a version of this that is performance-glad handing and hollow smiles and the rehearsed enthusiasm of someone selling something they do not entirely believe in. That was never my approach. Monroe FinTech had been built on real numbers and a real thesis, and every person I shook hands with that afternoon was someone I respected enough to be honest with. I answered questions directly. I did not oversell. When I did not have an answer, I said so and told them when I would. The conversations flowed well. The energy in the room was cautiously optimistic, which in the world of institutional finance is about as close to excitement as things tend to get before a signature is on paper. I was mid-conversation with a portfolio manager from a Boston-based fund, discussing our expansion timeline into the southeastern market when I felt the shift in the room before I saw its cause. It was subtle the way a current changes in water, a slight recalibration of attention near the entrance that rippled outward through the space. I kept my expression exactly where it was and finished my sentence before I allowed my gaze to move toward the door. She had not changed as much as 24 years should have changed a person. The woman who had walked into the Four Seasons ballroom was somewhere in her late 50s, dressed in clothes that were trying very hard to suggest a level of ease they had not quite earned. She moved through the entrance with the practiced confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime walking into rooms and demanding to be noticed, and she was succeeding, though perhaps not in the way she intended. Heads were turning. People were registering her presence with the instinctive social radar that wealthy gatherings develop for anything that does not quite belong. She spotted me across the room and smiled. It was the kind of smile that did not reach anything behind the eyes. Before I could assess the situation further, she was already approaching the nearest cluster of investors near the cocktail tables, extending her hand with the warmth of someone who had been expected, who belonged here entirely, who had every right to this room. "I am so proud of my daughter," she said to the group, her voice carrying easily over the ambient conversation. "She has always been extraordinary. I knew it from the day she was born." The words landed in my chest like stones dropped into still water. I kept my expression pleasant. I kept my posture open. I kept my hands relaxed at my sides. Not a single thing in my face or my body shifted from the professional warmth I had been projecting for the past 2 hours. This was not effortless. It was the result of years of deliberate practice, the discipline of a person who had learned very early that showing what you feel in the wrong moment cost you everything. A few feet behind this woman, hanging back near the entrance, with the particular stillness of someone who would rather be anywhere else on earth, stood a man in his mid-30s. He was tall, with a face that carried the kind of tension that comes from being trapped between two things you cannot reconcile. His eyes swept the room until they found mine, and then, with a speed that told me he had been dreading this moment, he looked away. The woman continued her circuit of the room, introducing herself to investors, collecting handshakes, deploying her smile with the strategic efficiency of someone running a very specific kind of operation. I watched her work from across the space while simultaneously continuing my own conversations, responding to questions, accepting a fresh glass of water from a passing server, laughing at the right moments. I was aware of Eleanor Ross before I saw her move. The older woman had positioned herself near the window with an unobstructed view of the entire room, which I had come to understand was simply how Eleanor operated. She watched the woman near the cocktail tables with an expression I had not seen her wear before. Not alarm exactly, something more like recognition, the careful stillness of someone who was cataloging information and reaching a conclusion they had not anticipated needing to reach. Eleanor's eyes moved from the woman to me. I gave her nothing. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and returned her attention to her drink. The investor I had been speaking with earlier, a silver-haired man who ran a family office out of Palm Beach, appeared at my elbow with the relaxed geniality of someone who had just had a pleasant conversation he wanted to share. "Lovely woman, your mother," he said warmly, nodding toward the other side of the room. "She was telling us about watching you build this company. She seems enormously proud of you." I looked at him. I kept my voice level, and my smile exactly where it had been all afternoon. "She should be," I said. He laughed, pleased, and moved on to refill his drink. I watched him go. Then I turned back to the room and let my gaze settle briefly on the woman who had just described herself to a roomful of investors as my loving, devoted, enormously proud mother. She was looking right at me. I held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then I turned away and picked up the thread of the nearest conversation, as though nothing of any significance had occurred, because as far as anyone in that ballroom could tell, nothing had. The reception wound down at 8. By 9:30, the last of the guests had filtered out, and the hotel staff had begun clearing the tables. I rode the elevator to the 24th floor, changed out of my suit, and sat at the small desk by the window with a glass of water and a printed copy of the next morning's presentation. The Miami night pressed against the glass, warm and humid and glittering. I was on page 3 when the knock came. 3 measured, deliberate taps against the door of my suite. Not hurried, not uncertain. The knock of someone who had decided exactly what they were going to say before their hand reached the door. 11 o'clock at night. I set the presentation down, smoothed the page flat with my palm, and looked at the door. The door of suite 2409 swung open, and for a moment neither of us spoke. She looked smaller than she had downstairs. In the ballroom, surrounded by a crowd and a performance to deliver, she had managed to fill the space with sheer force of presence. Up here in the quiet hallway of the 24th floor, with the overhead lighting casting everything in its honest and unflattering clarity, she was simply a woman in her late 50s standing outside a door she had not been invited to knock on. Her clothes were not right for this hotel. The blouse was polyester, the slacks pulling at the seams in ways that suggested they had been pressed many times over many years. She had made an effort, but the effort had a ceiling considerably lower than the $38 small batch soap in my bathroom. She had been crying or had arranged her face to suggest that she had. The distinction I had learned long ago mattered. "Zara," she said. My name in her mouth, after 24 years, sounded like a word in a language she had once known, and was now attempting to pronounce, from memory, BBI. I stepped back from the doorway. "Come in," I said. Not warmly, not coldly, the way you might hold a door open for a stranger. She hesitated for just a fraction of a second, then stepped across the threshold, and I closed the door behind her. The suite had a small sitting area near the windows, 2 low chairs, and a glass coffee table with a carafe of water and 2 unused glasses. I filled both, set one in front of the empty chair, and sat down in the other. Then I waited. She took the chair across from me, slowly, the way a person sits when they are not sure whether the surface will hold them. She looked around the room, once taking in the view, the furnishings, the careful evidence of a life assembled with considerable intention. Something moved through her expression that she did not fully manage to conceal. It was not admiration. It was closer to calculation, wearing admiration as a coat. "I have thought about this moment for so long," she began. Her voice had the texture of a prepared speech, attempting to sound unrehearsed. She pressed one hand flat against her chest. "There is not a day that has gone by that I have not thought about you, about us, about what I would say if I ever had the chance." "Would you like some water?" I said. She stopped. "The water?" I said, nodding toward the glass in front of her. "It is good. They filter it twice." She picked up the glass, took a small sip, set it back down. Then she found her footing again and continued. She covered the distance between guilt and appeal with practiced efficiency, moving through expressions of maternal devotion and curated vulnerability with the fluency of long preparation. She spoke about family, about second chances, about the particular courage it had taken to walk into that ballroom and find me. And then she arrived at the destination the entire performance had been building toward, $10 million. Described with remarkable creativity as a family investment opportunity. She had a contact, a business proposition, requiring initial capital, something with real potential. She would pay it back. She had a plan. She just needed someone who believed in her. When I did not respond, she shifted her approach with smooth efficiency. The warmth in her voice dropped several degrees, not into hostility, but into something more precisely calibrated. She had contacts in the media, she said. People who found stories like this one interesting. A major financial listing, a complicated family history. She was not threatening anyone. She wanted to be clear about that. She simply wanted me to understand the full picture. I let her finish. Then I set my water glass down on the table with a quiet, deliberate click. I looked at her directly for the first time since she had sat down. Not the careful peripheral attention I had been paying her, but a full, unguarded look that did not pretend to be anything other than what it was. "How much do you owe him, Vivian?" The question landed in the room like something dropped from a very great height. Every muscle in her face stopped moving at once. The performance, the warmth, the practiced grief, all of it evacuated her expression simultaneously, leaving behind something unguarded and pale and genuinely afraid. Her hand tightened around the water glass. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. I stood up. "You should not have come here, Vivian." I crossed the room, opened the suite door, and held it. After a long moment, she rose from the chair on unsteady legs and walked past me into the hallway without a word. I watched her go. Then I let the door close between us with a soft, final click that was somehow louder than anything either of us had said. 2 years earlier, the San Francisco office of Monroe FinTech occupied the top floor of a narrow building on Battery Street, 3 blocks from the waterfront and far enough from the tourist corridor that the neighborhood still felt like it belonged to the people who actually worked in it. By 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night, the floor was empty except for me. I had sent the last of my team home at 9. I preferred it this way. The particular quality of silence that settles over an office after hours when the phones stop and the ambient noise of other people's thinking goes quiet, and you can finally hear yourself work. I was at my desk with a cold cup of coffee and a financial model I had been revising for the better part of 3 hours when the secure message came through on my secondary laptop. James Okafor had been a private investigator for nearly 2 decades, specializing in discreet financial background work for clients who needed information gathered carefully and kept carefully. He was thorough, precise, and constitutionally incapable of embellishment, which was exactly why I had hired him. His reports read like technical documents. No editorializing, no commentary, just facts arranged in the order they had been discovered. The report he sent that Wednesday night was 47 pages long. I poured the cold coffee into the small sink in the corner of my office, made a fresh cup, and started reading from the beginning. The subject, a woman in her mid-50s, living in a 2-bedroom rental unit in the East Atlanta Village neighborhood, had maintained what Okafor described in his characteristically neutral language as a sustained, informal documentation practice spanning approximately 2 decades. What this meant, rendered into plain English, was that the woman had spent 24 years cutting articles about me out of newspapers and printing pages from the internet and collecting them in cardboard boxes that she kept stacked in the second bedroom of her apartment. Okafor had photographed the room. I looked at those photographs for a long time. The boxes were arranged along 2 walls, floor to ceiling, labeled by year in black marker. The earliest ones dated back to a regional academic competition I had placed in at the age of 14, a small notice in a local paper that most people would have missed entirely. There were clippings from my undergraduate years from the business school publication that had run a profile of me during my first year, from the early press coverage when Monroe FinTech was still small enough that the articles about us appeared only in niche financial newsletters. More recent materials filled the newer boxes, glossy magazine profiles, photographs, printouts of features from major publications. She had watched every step. I set the photographs down on my desk and sat with that information for a while. I examined what I felt about it and found somewhat to my own surprise that it was not what most people would expect. Not the cold shock of violation, not the hot rush of anger, not the complicated grief of someone confronting evidence of a relationship that might have been. What I felt was considerably quieter than any of those things. It was the particular stillness that arrives when a pattern you have long suspected is finally confirmed, when the shape of something you could not quite see resolves itself into clarity. She had never stopped watching. She had simply been waiting for the moment when what she was watching became worth reaching for. The question was not why. The why was obvious enough. The question was who else was involved, and that was the part of Okafor's report that kept me at my desk until well past 2 in the morning, because she had not arrived at this plan on her own. The financial specifics of what she was proposing, the timing relative to the IPO, the particular pressure points she intended to target these required information and coordination that a woman living on a fixed income in a 2-bedroom rental did not have the resources to develop independently. Someone had found her first. Someone had identified her as a useful instrument and had provided her with everything she needed to become one. There were others involved, people with real money and real motive. I needed to know all of them before I made my move. I did not close the laptop. I did not call anyone. I sat in the quiet of my empty office on Battery Street, and I thought through what I knew and what I needed to know, and what the shape of a proper response to this situation would look like if it were designed not merely to deflect, but to resolve permanently and completely. By the time I finally left the building, the sky over the bay had begun to lighten at its eastern edge. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked at it. Then I went home, slept for 3 hours, and came back to work. That had been the beginning. Now, in the present, on the 24th floor of the Four Seasons Brickell, the woman from those photographs was sitting in a hotel room 3 doors down from mine. I could not see her from where I stood at my own window, looking out at the Miami night, but I did not need to. I knew exactly where she was. I had known, with a reasonable degree of precision, where she was for the past 24 months. She thought she had finally found me after 24 years. She had no idea I had been the one leading her here all along. 6 in the morning in Miami has a particular quality of light that does not exist anywhere else quite the same way. The sun comes up fast and low over the water, turning everything briefly gold before the heat takes over and flattens the color out of the day. I had been awake for 2 hours already when I walked down the corridor of the 18th floor and stopped in front of room 1814. I had not brought anyone with me. No lawyers, no assistants, no one from my team who might have argued that this conversation should be handled differently through proper channels, with documentation and witnesses, and the careful choreography of people protecting themselves from liability. That was not the kind of conversation I needed to have. What I needed was a room with 2 people in it, and no performance required from either of them. I knocked twice and waited. It took longer than it should have. I heard movement behind the door, the particular shuffle of someone who had either not slept or had slept badly, followed by a pause that lasted just a beat too long, the pause of a person who already knew at some level who was standing on the other side. When the door finally opened, the man in the doorway looked like someone who had been awake since before I had. Brandon was 37 years old and carried his age. Age, the way certain men do not badly, but honestly, with the evidence of stress written into the set of his jaw and the slight tension around his eyes that does not fully release even when the rest of the face is attempting to appear relaxed. He was taller than I remembered, from the glimpse I had caught of him in the ballroom, broad-shouldered, wearing a gray t-shirt, and the expression of someone who had been rehearsing for this moment and had just realized his preparation was insufficient. He looked at me for a long moment without speaking. "May I come in?" I said. It was not quite a question. He stepped back. The room was a standard king, the kind of hotel room that is perfectly adequate and communicates nothing beyond adequacy. The bed had been slept in and not made. A carry-on bag sat open on the luggage rack, with clothes folded inside it, with the careful economy of someone accustomed to packing light and moving quickly. A half-finished bottle of water stood on the nightstand next to a phone that was face down. The curtains were open, and the early light came in flat across the carpet, illuminating a room that had the temporary, provisional quality of a place someone was staying, rather than anywhere they had chosen to be. I set my bag on the small desk near the window, unzipped it, and placed a manila folder on the desk surface. Then I pulled out the chair, sat down, and looked at him. He had not moved from the spot near the door where he had stepped back to let me in. His arms were crossed over his chest, in the posture of a person who is cold, though the room was not cold. "Sit down," I said. He sat on the edge of the bed. I opened the folder and turned it so the pages faced him. The top sheet was a summary document, clean and clearly formatted the kind that Okafor's team produced when they wanted information to be immediately legible to someone encountering it for the first time. Brandon leaned forward slightly, and I watched his eyes move across the page. I watched the exact moment the information registered, the almost imperceptible change in his breathing, the way his jaw tightened by a fraction. That is a summary of Monroe FinTech's Series B investor records, I said, specifically the portion that concerns a bridge loan drawn against the fund in the fourth quarter of 3 years ago. The loan was authorized under a signature that, when cross-referenced against the original partnership documents, does not match the signatory on file. Brandon said nothing. He was still looking at the page. The discrepancy is small enough that it was not caught in the standard audit cycle, I continued. It was caught because I asked someone to look for it specifically, which means it has not yet been reported to anyone outside this room. The silence that followed had a specific texture to it, the silence of someone calculating the distance between where they are standing and the nearest exit and arriving at the answer that there is no exit worth taking. She came to me, he said finally. His voice was low and had the flatness of someone who had stopped trying to frame things favorably. 3 years ago, she said she needed help. I was going to pay it back. I had a plan to pay it back before anyone noticed. He stopped. He pressed the heel of his hand against his forehead. It was not supposed to go this far. It never is, I said. He looked up at me then, and for a moment, something moved across his face that was not quite shame and not quite anger, but occupied the complicated territory between them. He opened his mouth to say something, then closed it. He tried again. I know what she is doing to you, he said quietly. With the IPO, I know she is not doing it alone. She has. There are people involved who... He stopped again, running a hand through his hair. I did not know it would go this far when I helped her the first time. I want you to know that. I know more than you think I do, I said. About all of it. He looked at me steadily for a moment. Then I leaned forward slightly. Do you remember the phone call you made 24 years ago at that airport? The effect was immediate and complete. Whatever he had been preparing to say next dissolved entirely. His hands, which had been moving with the restless energy of someone working through a difficult conversation, went still in his lap. The tension in his shoulders did not release. It transformed into something different, something older and heavier, that had apparently been waiting a long time for this exact question to arrive. He looked down at his hands. The room was very quiet. He did not say a word. The silence held for long enough that I began to think he would not answer at all. Then, something in him shifted. Not dramatically, not the way people break in movies with sudden tears and raised voices. It was quieter than that. His shoulders dropped by a fraction. His hands, still resting in his lap, turned palms up in a gesture that was not quite surrender and not quite supplication, but carried something of both. He drew a breath that was slightly uneven at its edges, the breath of a person stepping off a ledge they have been standing at the edge of for a very long time. I was in the back seat, he said. His voice was low and had the careful quality of someone choosing each word with the awareness that it cannot be unchosen. You were inside the terminal. I watched her drive away. He paused. I knew it was wrong. I knew it the second the car started moving. I was 12 years old, and I knew that what was happening was wrong, and I sat there, and I did not say anything, and I did not do anything, and she just drove. He stopped again. Outside the window, the Miami morning was brightening steadily, the early gold light giving way to the flat white of a day that intended to be hot. We were almost to the highway when I took her phone out of her purse. She had left it on the seat between us. I do not know why it was there. I do not know if I would have done anything differently if it had not been. He looked at the window rather than at me. I did not move. I called your grandmother, he said. Ruth, I had her number memorized because we had stayed with her the summer before, and she had made me write it down and repeat it back to her 3 times. She said a person should always know how to reach someone who loves them. A brief pause. I called her, and I said, Grandma, Zara is at the airport alone. Gate 7. Please go get her. He exhaled slowly. Then I put the phone back before our mother noticed it was gone. The room was very still. She never knew, he continued. For 21 years, she never knew I had made that call. I never told anyone. I just carried it. Every year, on that day in October, I carried it, and I told myself that you were fine, that Ruth had taken care of you, that what I had done was enough, even if it was not close to what I should have done. His jaw tightened. 3 years ago, she found out. I do not know how. She found old phone records, somehow, the kind of thing you would not think anyone would bother to look for after 2 decades. She called me, and she told me what she had found, and she told me what it would cost me to keep it quiet. He finally looked at me directly. She said she would tell people that I had known you were there, and had deliberately chosen not to help you, that I had watched and done nothing. She said she would make sure everyone believed that version. My investors, my partners, people I had spent years building trust with. His voice had the exhausted flatness of someone describing a trap they have been inside long enough to have memorized its dimensions. So I helped her the first time, and then there was a second time, and then a third. And each time the amount was larger, and the story she held over me grew, and I could not find a way out that did not destroy everything I had built. He pressed both hands flat against his knees. I saved you, and I have been paying for it every single day since. The words came out stripped of everything, except their own weight. No performance in them, no bid for sympathy. Just the plain statement of a man who had run out of ways to make the truth sound better than it was. I am so sorry, Zara. I know that does not fix anything. I know it does not come close to fixing anything. But I am. His voice caught on the last word in a way he clearly had not intended. And for a moment, his face did something complicated and unguarded, the expression of someone who has been holding a particular kind of grief in a particular place for so long, that when it finally moves, it surprises even them. I had sat through his entire account without speaking, without shifting in my chair, without giving him anything to read in my face that might tell him how the information was landing or what I intended to do with it. I had listened the way I always listened when the information mattered completely and without commentary, storing everything in its proper place. Now I stood up. I picked up the manila folder from the desk, returned it to my bag, and zipped the bag closed with a single, smooth motion. I pulled the strap over my shoulder. I walked to the door of the room and put my hand on the handle. Zara. His voice behind me was quiet. Not a demand. Something closer to a question that did not know how to finish itself. I opened the door. The corridor outside was empty, the low hum of the hotel's air system, the only sound in either direction. I stepped through the doorway and let the door fall closed behind me. The latch clicked into place with a sound barely louder than a breath. By 8 o'clock, the temporary offices on the 31st floor had been transformed into something that no longer resembled a pre-IPO workspace. The whiteboards that had previously held allocation figures and investor talking points had been cleared and rewritten with a different kind of information entirely. Marcus had arrived before everyone else and had arranged the conference table with the focused precision of a man who understood that the quality of a meeting's preparation often determines its outcome before the first person sits down. I came in from the elevator at 8:05. Brandon arrived 2 minutes later, taking the chair at the far end of the table with the quiet, deliberate movement of someone who has recently put down something heavy and is not entirely sure yet how to carry themselves without it. He did not look at me directly. I did not require him to. Eleanor was already seated at the center of the table with a thin leather portfolio open in front of her and a cup of coffee she had apparently brought herself from somewhere downstairs. She looked as she always looked, like someone who had arrived at the correct conclusion before the meeting started and was now waiting with patience for everyone else to catch up. Marcus closed the door. Terravault Capital, Eleanor said, without preamble, turning the portfolio so its contents faced the center of the table. She did not need to clear her throat or call the room to attention. When Eleanor Ross began speaking, rooms simply listened. They are a mid-sized private equity operation out of Chicago. They have been positioning themselves for the past 18 months to acquire a controlling stake in the financial technology infrastructure sector. Monroe Fintech represents the most significant independent asset in that space, currently approaching a liquidity event. She slid a document across the table. It was a transaction record, clean and formally formatted, showing a series of wire transfers originating from a holding entity registered in Delaware. These funds moved through 3 intermediary accounts before landing in a personal checking account belonging to a woman in Atlanta, Eleanor continued. The total amount transferred over the past 6 months represents a retainer of sorts, payment for a specific service. Marcus leaned forward and studied the document. They paid her to approach Zara before the IPO. They identified her as a pressure point, Eleanor said. Someone with a personal claim that could generate enough public noise to either delay the listing or force a valuation reduction significant enough to make a distressed acquisition viable. She paused. It is not an unsophisticated strategy. It requires very little capital relative to the potential return. Brandon had been looking at the table surface since Eleanor began. Now he spoke without raising his eyes. She told me about the approach 6 months ago. She did not tell me where the money was coming from. She said she had found a way to make things right, and she needed me to stay out of it. A pause. I did not stay out of it the way I should have. The room absorbed this without comment. Marcus pulled up a separate document on his laptop and turned the screen to face the group. From a legal exposure standpoint, we are looking at potential claims on multiple fronts. The wire transfers constitute a documentable coordination between TerraVault and a third party for the purpose of interfering with a regulated securities offering. That is the kind of thing that draws regulatory attention very quickly once it is properly presented. He looked at me. The question is how we present it, and to whom, and in what sequence. I had been listening to all of this from my seat at the head of the table. I had not taken notes. I had not interrupted. I had let the information assemble itself into the shape it was already becoming, because I had known most of it before I walked through the door that morning, and I had needed the others to arrive at the same place through their own examination of the evidence. We do not defend, I said. That is the first thing. We do not issue statements. We do not grant interviews. We do not ask anyone to take our word for anything. Marcus nodded slowly. Offensive posture. The truth is the posture, I said. We have documentation. We have transaction records. We have a witness who can speak to the coordination directly. I glanced briefly at Brandon. He was looking at the table again, but something in the set of his shoulders had changed. We use what we have, where it will have the most impact at the moment, when it cannot be walked back or spun into something else. Eleanor had been watching me through this exchange, with the particular quality of attention she reserved for moments she considered significant. Now, she set her coffee cup down and was quiet for a moment, in a way that signaled she was about to say something she had been holding. There is something I have not told you, she said, that I perhaps should have told you some time ago. The room waited. 24 years ago, I was traveling through Atlanta, on my way back from a conference in Savannah, she said. I had a connection at Hartsfield-Jackson. I was in the terminal near Gate 7 when I noticed a young girl standing by herself with a small suitcase. She was not crying. She was not asking anyone for help. She was simply standing there, holding something in her hands, with the particular stillness of a child who has already decided that the situation she is in is one she will have to manage on her own. Eleanor's voice was entirely steady. She was not the kind of woman who dressed things in sentiment she had not earned. I asked an airport employee to check on her. I gave them my card in case anyone needed to reach me. I do not know what happened after that. I flew to New York and I went back to my life. She looked at me directly. 8 years ago, when a mutual contact suggested I take a meeting with the founder of a small fintech startup in San Francisco, I walked into that office and I recognized the quality of that stillness immediately. I have never mentioned it because it was not mine to mention, but I think you should know. The silence that followed was different from any silence that had come before it in this room. I never forgot that little girl standing alone at Gate 7, Eleanor said quietly. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I looked at the whiteboard. Then I stood up. 48 hours, I said. By the time they walk into that IPO, it will already be over. Nobody asked me what I meant. Nobody needed to. The alert came through at 6:14 in the morning while my driver was merging onto the expressway toward Miami International. I had been awake since 4:30, which was not unusual for me on days that mattered. I had reviewed the final presentation materials, confirmed the logistics with Marcus, and eaten half a container of yogurt standing at the kitchen counter of my hotel suite while watching the sky outside shift from black to the particular deep blue that precedes sunrise over the water. By the time I was in the car, I had already done more thinking than most people do before noon. The notification appeared on my screen with the clean, unadorned formatting that financial news terminals use when they want you to understand that what you are reading is not opinion, but information. The headline was direct and had clearly been written by someone who understood that the most effective way to introduce doubt is to frame it as a question that has already been answered. Monroe FinTech CEO conceals troubled family past ahead of landmark IPO. I read it once. Then I set my phone face down on the seat beside me and looked out the window at the highway moving past. The Miami sprawl was just beginning to wake up warehouses and overpasses and the particular flat commercial landscape of a city that does most of its interesting living out of sight from the roads connecting its airports. My phone began to move against the leather seat before we reached the departures terminal. The call started with a portfolio manager I had spoken with 3 times in the past month, a careful and methodical man who opened by saying he was sure this was nothing, but felt he owed it to his partners to ask directly. I told him I appreciated the call and that I would ask him to do one thing: come to the listing this morning. Stay until the opening remarks are finished. If he still had questions after that, I would answer every one of them personally. He said he would think about it. I told him that was all I was asking. The second call was less measured. A managing director at a fund that had committed a significant position wanted to understand in his words why he was reading about his portfolio company on a financial news platform at 6 in the morning. I gave him the same answer I had given the first caller, with the same tone and the same specific invitation. Come to the listing. All of it would be clear. By the time I reached the gate, I had taken 4 more calls of varying intensity and delivered the same response to each of them. I was not evasive. I was not defensive. I simply declined to have the conversation they wanted to have in the venue they wanted to have it and redirected every one of them toward the same point in time. I boarded and found my seat and put my bag in the overhead bin and sat down. Marcus had texted that the online conversation was moving faster than anticipated, that it had picked up traction on financial commentary channels and was being aggregated by several outlets that covered pre-IPO activity. People who had no stake in the outcome were forming opinions. People who did have a stake were watching those opinions and recalibrating their own. Somewhere over the Carolinas, a video clip arrived in my inbox, forwarded by a member of my communications team, with a note that said simply, "You should see this." The clip was 90 seconds long. It had been recorded outside a coffee shop somewhere in Miami, the kind of casual, apparently spontaneous setting that requires considerable effort to arrange. The woman being interviewed had dressed carefully for the occasion, in clothes that communicated hardship without being theatrical about it. She spoke with the practiced fluency of someone who had prepared her remarks and then rehearsed them until they sounded unrehearsed. She described herself as a mother who had spent decades searching for a daughter who had pushed her away. She used the word abandoned twice. She mentioned the IPO by name and suggested that the timing of her coming forward was not calculated, but simply inevitable, the natural result of a woman who could no longer stay silent, while her daughter built a public image on a foundation of private cruelty. I watched the clip to the end. Then I closed it and looked out the window at the cloud cover below us, solid and white and unbroken all the way to the horizon. I nodded once to no one in particular. This was exactly what I had expected. The clip was well produced. The framing was effective. Left unanswered, it would create exactly the kind of ambient doubt that TerraVault needed to make their approach viable. As a piece of coordinated interference with a securities offering, it was also, I noted, with some professional appreciation, the kind of thing that documenting agencies found very interesting when it was brought to their attention with sufficient supporting evidence. My phone rang with a number I did not recognize. I answered it because I had been expecting this call. The man who spoke identified himself as a senior representative of TerraVault Capital. He was polished and spoke with the particular smoothness of someone accustomed to having difficult conversations that end in his favor. He expressed, with what sounded like genuine concern, his worry about the morning's developments. He suggested that the situation created an opportunity for both parties to find a mutually beneficial path forward. He mentioned a figure. The figure represented a reduction of approximately 40% from our projected listing valuation. I listened to him complete his sentence. Then I ended the call. A message arrived from Brandon 11 minutes later. No greeting, no explanation, just a compressed file containing transaction records he had obtained through channels he did not specify, documentation that filled in two gaps in the TerraVault evidence chain that had been present since Okafor's original report. I opened the file, reviewed the contents, and forwarded it to Marcus with a single line of instruction. The wheels of the aircraft touched the runway at LaGuardia with the particular firmness of a landing that means business. They thought the leak would break me. They had just handed me the final piece I needed. The city never truly went dark. That was the one thing I had learned after nearly 3 years of working out of New York Manhattan. Did not sleep. It only shifted. The grid of lights outside the 32nd floor window changed its rhythm after midnight, slower, quieter, but never went out entirely. I stood there with my arms folded across my chest and my reflection faint against the glass, watching the skyline hold its breath the same way I was holding mine. The Monroe FinTech office was empty. Every desk cleared, every screen dark, except for the 2 monitors at my station, still running the final pre-market reports. Marcus had left at 10, offering to stay. I told him to go. Eleanor had called at 11, her voice the kind of steady that only comes from decades of watching markets rise and collapse and rise again. She said 3 words before she hung up. "You are ready." I held the phone for a moment after the line went silent, then set it face down on the desk. I was not afraid. That surprised me more than anything else about this night. I had expected fear. I had planned for it, the way you plan for weather, packed, extra patience, prepared, rational arguments to talk myself down from the edge. But standing in that quiet office, with the weight of everything pressing gently against my sternum, what I felt was not fear. It was something older, something I did not have a clean word for. It came without warning, the way those things always do. Not a memory, exactly. More like a sensation, the way smell can reach further back than thought. For just a moment, no longer than a breath, I caught it, that particular mixture of recycled air, an industrial cleaner, and something almost sweet underneath the kind of smell that belongs only to airports, to departure gates, to the specific quality of loneliness that exists in a place designed entirely for people who are on their way somewhere else. I had not been back to that airport since the morning I left it. I did not let the feeling linger. I had learned a long time ago that the past was most useful when you refused to let it drive. You could keep it in the back seat. You could even let it remind you why you were going where you were going. But you kept your hands on the wheel. I turned back to the monitors. The pre-market indicators were steady. Marcus had run 3 separate risk models. All of them landed within the acceptable range. The institutional commitments were locked. Eleanor's network had held. Whatever noise the leak had created out there on the financial networks, the structure we had built beneath this IPO was solid in the way that mattered. It was true. I was still reviewing the final filing summary when I heard the knock 3 times. Quiet. The kind of knock that does not want to wake anyone, only to be heard. I checked the time. Just past midnight. I crossed the office and opened the door. Brandon stood in the hallway, still wearing the same jacket he had on the plane. He looked like he had not slept, which I suspected was accurate. In his right hand, he held a sealed manila envelope, thick edges slightly bent, the way paper gets when someone has been gripping it too long. He did not say anything at first. He just held it out. I looked at the envelope, then at him. He cleared his throat. I reached out to 2 people independently, former colleagues of mine who had worked adjacent to TerraVault's early funding structure. Off the record, nothing traceable back to Monroe FinTech. He paused. What's in there they can't claim they didn't know. It fills the last 2 gaps. I took the envelope. He said, I owe you this, 24 years worth. I did not answer. I stepped back from the doorway, and he came inside. And for a few minutes, we simply sat him in the chair across from my desk, me on the edge of the desk itself, and neither of us said anything. The city kept its quiet rhythm outside the window. The monitors ran their numbers. The office held us the way silence does when 2 people finally stop performing composure for each other. It was Brandon who spoke first. What happens to her? His voice was low. He was not looking at me. After tomorrow? What happens to Vivienne? I thought about it. Not long, because I had already thought about it longer than I would ever admit to anyone. The same thing that happened to me at that airport, I said. She lands somewhere alone. What she does next is up to her. Brandon nodded slowly, the way people nod when an answer is fair, but still heavy. He stared at his hands for a moment, then looked out at the skyline. I watched him process all of it, the years, the wait, the fact that some reckonings do not come with clean edges. We sat there a while longer. Eventually, he stood, straightened his jacket, and said goodnight. I walked him to the door. He paused at the threshold and looked back once briefly, the way people do when they want to say something they cannot quite find the words for. Then he left. I locked the door and returned to the window. The clock on my monitor read 12:07. I pressed my fingertips to the glass, cool and solid against the night. 24 years ago, a woman had set a small suitcase on an airport floor and walked away without looking back. She had not known then, could not have imagined, that the child she left behind would spend the next 2 decades building something so precise, so deliberate, that the morning after would feel less like a beginning and more like the final move in a very long game. It was officially the 24th anniversary of the day she left me, and in 6 hours, the opening bell of the New York Stock Exchange would ring for Monroe FinTech. The waiting room smelled like fresh paint and old money. That was the first thing I noticed when the NYSE coordinator led us through the side corridor at 9:15, that particular combination of recently refinished walls and something heavier underneath the accumulated weight of decades of deals closed and fortunes shifted inside these halls. A framed photograph of the original trading floor hung near the entrance to the holding area. I glanced at it once, then looked away. Eleanor was already inside when I arrived. She stood near the far wall with her portfolio case at her feet and her hands clasped in front of her, watching the door. She did not say good morning. She simply looked at me the way she had looked at me in the war room 2 mornings ago, steady, assessing, satisfied, and gave a single nod. I nodded back. The holding room was modest for what it represented. A rectangular space with a long mirror on one wall, 2 chairs, neither of us sat in, and a flat-screen monitor mounted near the ceiling, showing the live feed from the floor below. Through the monitor, I could hear it, the trading floor, already running at its morning frequency, that particular roar that sounded less like human noise and more like weather. Hundreds of voices layered into something that had no single source, rising and shifting in waves. I had heard recordings of it before. Standing 20 feet above it was different. I adjusted the collar of my jacket, navy, well cut, chosen 3 weeks ago for exactly this morning. At 9:22, my phone lit up. Marcus, all confirmations received. The relevant federal authority is positioned and ready. Everything is in place. You have the floor. I read the message twice, then slid the phone into my interior pocket. The relevant federal authority. Marcus had a talent for language that obscured, without lying, a quality I had come to rely on. What the message meant, in plain terms, was that the process we had set in motion, built carefully over 2 years, and finalized in the last 48 hours, had reached the point where it no longer needed me to manage it. It only needed me to speak. On the monitor above us, I caught a brief cut to a remote feed, a secondary camera angle, showing a separate viewing area, the kind reserved for observers who did not have floor access. I could not make out individual faces clearly at this distance and resolution, but I recognized the configuration. 2 groups seated apart. One of them would be Vivienne. The other I knew from the seating manifest Marcus had sent last night, represented TerraVault Capital's executive team, present, to watch what they believed would be either a controlled narrative or a containable damage event. They had misread the situation entirely. I turned away from the monitor. Eleanor spoke for the first time since I had arrived. "How are your hands?" It was an odd question. I looked down at them. Steady. Completely steady. "Fine," I said. She almost smiled. "Good. That's how I knew you know. When I first met you at the pitch in San Francisco 3 years ago, everyone else in that room had something going on with their hands. Clicking pens, adjusting watches. You just held them still." She paused. "I thought this one has been still before when it counted." I did not respond to that. There was nothing useful I could add to it. At 9:26, the coordinator returned and gave us the 2-minute signal. Eleanor picked up her portfolio case and moved toward the door that led to the floor-level entrance. She would take her seat in the front row of the designated guest section, visible deliberate a signal to every institutional eye in that room that Ross Capital was not moving. I stayed where I was for another 30 seconds, not because I was hesitating. I had stopped hesitating about this a long time ago. I stayed because I had learned the hard way in rooms much less forgiving than this one, that the moment before you walk into something is the last moment it belongs only to you. Once you cross the threshold, it becomes public. It becomes permanent. It becomes part of the record. I let it be mine for 30 more seconds. Then I walked out. The trading floor hit me like a change in air pressure. The sound, the light, the specific density of that many people in a single space, holding their collective attention on a single point. The podium was set at the elevated platform, near the bell mechanism draped with the Monroe FinTech banner, the ticker symbol MFT already cycling on the digital displays flanking the main board. I walked the length of the floor, without looking at anyone directly, the way you move through a crowded room when you need the room to come to you. I reached the podium at 9:28. I set my notes on the surface in front of me. I did not open them. I looked out at the assembled floor, analysts, journalists, floor traders, guests, cameras, and I took one breath, slow, the kind that goes all the way down. The noise did not stop immediately. It never does, but it shifted, lowered. The particular quality of attention in a room changes when the person at the front is not performing readiness, but actually has it. I had noticed this before in smaller rooms. It scaled. I leaned toward the microphone. "Good morning. My name is Zara Monroe. And before I tell you about this company, I need to tell you about a little girl who once stood alone at an airport with a one-way ticket and a promise she made to herself." The floor went quiet. Not the polite quiet of an audience settling. The specific absolute quiet of a room that has just understood collectively that what is about to happen was not on any of their agendas this morning. No one moved. That was what I noticed first. Not the cameras, not the analysts with their tablets and styluses, not the floor traders who had paused mid-conversation to look up at the platform. No one moved. The trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange, a space that operated on the principle that stillness was lost, opportunity had gone completely still. I let it be still. For 3 full seconds, I simply stood at the podium and let the weight of what I had just said settle across the room the way snow settles quietly, completely covering everything it touches. Then I continued. My mother bought me a one-way ticket. She thought it was an ending. I paused. It was actually the beginning. A murmur moved through the floor. Not disbelief, more like the collective exhale of a room adjusting to a new center of gravity. I had given a great many presentations in my career. Pitch meetings, board reviews, quarterly calls, where the numbers did the talking, and I simply translated. I had learned that audiences adjusted fastest when you gave them something true and then waited for them to catch up to it. I waited now. I was 9 years old. I did not know anyone in that airport. I had $43 in a small envelope that my grandmother had tucked into my coat pocket the last time I saw her, and a gate number written on a piece of paper in handwriting that was not mine. What I did not have was a reason to believe that the person who had just walked away from me would ever be held accountable for that moment. The floor was quiet enough that I could hear the ambient hum of the display systems behind me. 24 years is a long time to build something. Long enough, it turns out, to build it correctly. I reached for the small remote on the podium surface. This was the moment I had rehearsed the least, because rehearsing it had felt like practicing something that was already true. You did not rehearse the truth. You simply delivered it cleanly and let it stand on its own. Monroe FinTech was not built on inherited advantage. It was not built on connections or on access or on the kind of confidence that comes from never having had a reason to doubt yourself. It was built on the specific knowledge that comes from having nothing and understanding very clearly what that means. I clicked the remote. The first slide appeared on the screen behind me. Not a revenue chart, not a growth projection. A document, a series of wire transfer records, cleanly formatted dates and amounts, visible to anyone in the room with a clear line of sight. Several cameras pivoted. I heard the particular sound of fingers moving quickly across keyboards. 41 days before today, I said, a private equity firm based in Chicago initiated a series of financial transfers. The destination of those transfers was a personal account registered in the state of Georgia. The total amount moved across 4 separate transactions was $230,000. I let the number exist in the room for a moment. The purpose of those transfers, as documented in the communications recovered alongside these records, was to fund a coordinated effort to introduce damaging and misleading narratives about Monroe FinTech's leadership into financial media channels ahead of this offering. In simpler terms, someone tried to buy my silence before this IPO. I advanced the slide. The next document appeared a thread of communications sender and recipient fields, visible key passages, highlighted without editorial comment. The room's energy shifted again tighter. This time, the way attention tightens when something moves from the emotional to the evidentiary. Let me show you exactly who and exactly how much they paid. The firm name appeared on screen. TerraVault Capital, Chicago, Illinois, founded 11 years ago. Assets under management listed in their most recent public filing at approximately $4.2 billion. I did not need to editorialize. The documents did that work on their own. TerraVault Capital identified Monroe FinTech as a competitive threat to 2 of their existing portfolio companies 18 months ago. That assessment is documented in their internal strategy memos, copies of which were provided to the relevant federal authority 48 hours ago. Another murmur, louder this time. I saw 2 people in the press section, already on their phones, and I noted that without reacting to it. That was expected. That was, in fact, part of the design. I want to be precise about something, I said, and the room quieted again. I am not standing here today as a victim. I am standing here as the chief executive of a company that is going public this morning, on its own terms, with its own record, and with complete transparency about the attempt that was made to prevent exactly that. I paused once more, not for drama, for accuracy, to make certain that what came next landed with the weight it carried. The individual recruited to execute this effort is someone I have known for 24 years. Someone who was present at that airport. Someone who until very recently believed that the distance between that morning and this one was large enough to make her actions untraceable. No murmur this time. Nothing. Just the hum of the systems. She was incorrect. I advanced the final slide. The wire transfer records again, but this time, the receiving account's registered name was visible. Clear, unambiguous. And now, I said, let me show you something that arrived on my desk last night. The screen behind me shifted. The room did not breathe. Then the room exhaled. It came all at once. That collective release of held breath that happens when a crowd absorbs something too large to process in silence any longer. The trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange, which had been holding itself with the particular discipline of people who understood that composure was professional currency, finally broke. Not into chaos, into noise, the specific layered noise of several hundred people reaching the same conclusion at different speeds and reacting accordingly. Cameras swung toward the screen. Analysts leaned forward. I could see two journalists already moving toward the edges of the floor, phones raised, feeds running. The wire transfer records on the screen behind me were detailed, time-stamped, and sourced the kind of documentation that did not invite interpretation. It simply presented the numbers, the dates, the account names, the routing information. 4 transactions across 41 days, every dollar traceable. I stepped back slightly from the microphone. Not away from it, just back. Enough to signal that what came next was not going to come from me. It came from the 4th row of the guest section. Brandon stood up slowly. He did not raise his hand. He did not wait to be called upon. He simply rose to his feet, the way a person rises when they have made a decision they cannot unmake and have chosen to stop delaying it. His jacket was the same one from the plane. His posture was the posture of someone carrying weight they had decided finally to set down in public. He spoke without a microphone, but the floor had quieted enough that his voice carried. My name is Brandon Monroe. I am Zara Monroe's brother. And everything you are looking at on that screen, I can confirm it. All of it. His voice was not steady. It was something better than steady. It was clear. The kind of clarity that comes not from the absence of feeling, but from the decision to speak anyway. I was approached 14 months ago by a representative of TerraVault Capital. I was told that my cooperation in providing access to Monroe FinTech's internal communications would result in certain personal financial matters being resolved. I refused. What I did not do at the time was report the approach. He paused. I am reporting it now. No one interrupted him. No one asked a question. The floor gave him the room the way a room gives room to someone who is clearly paying a price for what they are saying. He sat down. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then Eleanor stood. She did not move from her seat in the front row, just rose to her full height, unhurried, the way a person stands when they are not performing anything, only being present. At 71, Eleanor Ross had the particular quality of someone who had long since stopped needing the approval of any room she walked into. She simply occupied space with a kind of authority that had nothing to do with volume. My name is Eleanor Ross. I am the founding partner of Ross Capital, and I am the largest institutional investor in Monroe FinTech. She let that register. 8 years ago, a 25-year-old walked into a pitch meeting in San Francisco and presented a payments infrastructure model that my team had told me was not worth my time. They were wrong. The faintest pause. I have been watching her build this company from nothing for 8 years, and I was the one who found her at Gate 7. The room stilled again. I did not know who she was that morning 24 years ago. I knew only that a child was standing alone at a departure gate with a ticket in her hand and no adult in sight. I stayed with her until her grandmother arrived. I have thought about that morning many times since. She looked directly at me on the podium. I am glad I know how the story continued. She sat down. I was still at the podium. I had not planned to stand there through both of those testimonies, but I understood watching them unfold that my stillness was doing its own work, that the image of me holding the podium, without reacting, without breaking, without performing either gratitude or vindication, was itself a kind of statement. So I held it. What happened next happened quickly. Near the East Corridor entrance, 3 individuals in dark professional attire moved onto the floor with the calm, deliberate efficiency of people who had been waiting for a specific moment and had now reached it. They did not announce themselves loudly. They did not need to. The guest section near the back of the room registered their arrival. Before the floor did, I saw the shift in posture, the turning of heads, the particular stillness of a group of people who suddenly understood that the exits were no longer as available as they had assumed. The Terravault contingent had come to watch a controlled narrative. They were escorted out in the middle of one instead. No raised voices, no disruption to the floor proceedings. The whole thing took less than 4 minutes, and by the time it was complete, the only indication that it had happened was the empty cluster of seats near the back and the cameras that had pivoted briefly to follow before returning their attention to the platform. Then at 9:30, precisely, the bell rang. The sound of it moved through the floor like something physical, that single, resonant tone that had opened every trading day in this building for generations. On the digital boards flanking the main display, the ticker MFT appeared. The opening price held for 2 seconds. Then it moved. It moved up. I watched the number climb from the podium. My hands still at my sides, my expression still what it had been since I walked onto this floor, present, composed exactly as I had intended. The board updated again and again. By the time the opening sequence settled into its rhythm, Monroe FinTech was trading at 31% above its offering price. Somewhere in the building, in one of the overflow viewing areas, where observers without floor credentials had gathered to watch the proceedings on a secondary feed, I knew she was there, watching the same numbers I was watching, processing in whatever way she was capable of processing what they meant. Somewhere below, I knew she was watching the numbers climb. Every single dollar was an answer to a question she should have never asked. The air outside was sharp and cold. After the contained atmosphere of the trading floor, recycled pressurized tasting, faintly of electronics, and collective tension. The late morning air on Broad Street hit differently, clear, unfiltered, the kind of cold that does not apologize for itself. I stood on the top step of the NYSE entrance for a moment and let it settle against my face before I looked for her. I did not have to look long. She was perhaps 30 feet away, slightly off the main pedestrian flow, standing with the particular stillness of someone who had run out of directions to move. The crowd around her was shifting foot traffic from the financial district, mixing with the small cluster of journalists who had picked up her presence sometime in the last hour and had begun to converge. 2 of them had cameras. 3 more had phones raised. 1 was already speaking into a recorder, her voice low and rapid. On the large digital display mounted on the building across the street, the Monroe FinTech ticker cycled every few seconds. The number had not stopped climbing. Vivian was watching it. She was wearing the same coat she had worn to the roadshow in Miami, a dark wool blend, well cut, but older, the kind of garment that had once been expensive and now carried its age in the way the fabric sat at the shoulders. In the gray November light of Lower Manhattan, standing under a screen that was broadcasting the precise scale of her miscalculation to anyone who cared to look, she appeared smaller than she had in the Four Seasons corridor, smaller than she had in my memory, which was saying something, because the woman in my memory had always occupied more space than the room required. I came down the steps. The journalists noticed me first. The cluster reorganized itself instinctively, the way press does when the primary subject enters the frame, pivoting, adjusting, raising equipment. I held up one hand, not unkindly, and said clearly enough to be heard, "She and I need a moment, please." Remarkably, they gave it to us. Not all of them stepped back far, but far enough. Vivian turned when she heard my voice. What I saw in her face was not what I had expected, which was anger or calculation, or the particular performance of maternal grief she had deployed so effectively in Suite 2409. What I saw was something I had no clean name for. It was older than any of those things. It was, I thought, the expression of someone who had finally reached the end of a very long story they had been telling themselves. and found that the ending did not resemble any of the versions they had rehearsed. She opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. Zara, my name in her voice. Nothing else for a moment. Then, I know I have no right to ask you for anything. I know that. But you are my daughter. Whatever else is true, whatever happened, blood is thicker than water. You know that. I let her finish. Then I reached into the interior pocket of my jacket and produced a sealed envelope. Cream-colored standard weight. I held it out to her. She looked at it, looked at me, looked back at it. Take it, I said. She took it with both hands. The way people take things they are not certain are safe. She turned it over once. Her name was written on the front in my handwriting. Not a legal name, not a formal address. Just Vivienne. She worked the flap open slowly, and I watched her register the contents in sequence. The airline confirmation first. A one-way fare booked that morning, departing LaGuardia at 4:15 that afternoon. Destination, Atlanta. Then the folded sheets beneath it, a printed address, a name, a phone number, a residential program on the north side of the city. Clean, reputable operating for nearly 2 decades. The kind of place that did not ask questions about the past, only about the next step forward. And beneath that, a cashier's check. The amount covered the sum she owed to the man who had been holding that debt over her head, the same debt that had set everything in motion, that had made her reachable by the people who had found her useful. Enough to clear it entirely, with a modest remainder. Not a fortune, not a gesture of wealth. Enough, exactly enough. She stared at the check for a long time. When she looked up, her eyes were doing something I had not seen them do in the roadshow suite, or in the airport memory I carried, or in any version of her I had constructed across 24 years of distance. They were uncertain, genuinely, completely uncertain, in the way of someone who has lost access to the script they have always relied on. Why? She said. It was not quite a question. Because, I said, this is more than you ever gave me. Use it well. She looked back down at the envelope. Her hands were not steady. The coat moved slightly at her shoulders, the particular tremble of someone trying to hold something together at the surface, while something else shifts underneath. For the first time in every interaction I could remember or imagine having with this woman, she did not speak. Not a word. Not a performance. Not a calculation dressed as feeling. Just silence. I held her gaze for one more moment. Long enough to be sure she understood that what I was giving her was real, and that it was also complete, that there was nothing beyond it. No further conversation, no renegotiation, no door left open for a different version of this story. Then I turned around. The journalists were still there, held at a professional distance, cameras trained on us. I walked back through them, without stopping, without answering the questions that began immediately. My name, a comment, a response to the morning, to the arrests, to the numbers on the board. I kept walking. Up the steps, through the main entrance, back into the building, where the opening session of Monroe FinTech's first day as a public company was still running on every screen. Behind me, the city continued its noise. I did not look back. For the first time in 24 years, there was absolutely nothing behind me worth looking back for. The party had been Marcus's idea. Not a formal event, there had been no time to plan one. And besides, that was not how Monroe FinTech operated. What it was in practice was the entire New York team crowded into the 32nd floor office with catered food that had arrived somehow. Between the closing bell and 4 o'clock, a sound system, playing at a volume that suggested someone had made an executive decision about the afternoon's productivity and the particular energy of people who had worked toward something for a very long time and were now finally allowed to feel that it had happened. I had stayed for the first hour. I had shaken hands and accepted embraces and said the things that were true, that none of it was possible without this team, that the morning had gone the way it did because of work done long before today, that I was proud of every person in this room. All of it was accurate. All of it came from somewhere real. Then I had stepped outside. The balcony off the main conference room was narrow and faced north, which meant you got the full length of Midtown, rather than the financial district's more compact geometry. In the late afternoon, with the sun already dropping behind the west side. The buildings held the light on their upper floors and released it slowly, that particular Manhattan hour, when the city looks less like infrastructure and more like something that had decided for a few minutes to be beautiful on purpose. I had been standing there for perhaps 10 minutes when I heard the glass door open behind me. I did not turn around. I did not need to. Brandon came to stand beside me at the railing. Not too close. The appropriate distance of someone who understood that proximity right now was something to be earned rather than assumed. He was still in the same jacket. I wondered briefly if he owned another one, then let the thought go. We stood in silence for a moment, looking out at the city. "The team is asking about you," he said. "They know where I am." Another pause. The sound of the celebration inside was muffled through the glass present, but at a remove, like music from a neighboring apartment. "The federal authority confirmed the full scope about an hour ago," Brandon said. "TerraVault's senior partners are cooperating. The CEO is not, but apparently that is not going to help him." I nodded. That had been Marcus's last update before I stepped outside, 3 lines in a message. Characteristically precise. Characteristically understated. The process that had been set in motion 48 hours ago was proceeding on its own momentum now. That part no longer required my attention. Brandon turned slightly toward me. "Not fully just enough. What happens to us now?" The question sat in the air between us. I had known it was coming, had known it since the night before, since he had walked into the office at midnight with an envelope and said, "I owe you this," and meant it in more directions than one. The question was not really about logistics. It was about whether there was an us that existed after everything that had been said and documented and aired in a room full of cameras and federal personnel that morning. I let it sit for another few seconds before I answered. "That depends entirely on what you do next." He absorbed that, did not push back against it, did not ask for clarification. That, I thought, was itself an answer, of a kind. The Brandon of 3 years ago, of 14 months ago, when TerraVault had first made their approach, would have asked a follow-up question designed to negotiate the terms. He did not negotiate now. I reached into my jacket and produced a second envelope. This one was thicker than the one I had given Vivian. Heavier. I held it out without explanation and waited for him to take it. He took it, opened it carefully, the way he had learned perhaps this morning, that things given in envelopes deserved to be opened with attention. Inside was a document, 12 pages tabbed with the Monroe FinTech letterhead at the top of the first page, and a summary paragraph that laid out the essential terms in plain language before the legal sections began. A structured repayment arrangement. The investors whose funds had been misused 3 years ago, the people Brandon had wronged, whose trust had been redirected to cover a debt that was not theirs to carry, would be made whole. Monroe FinTech would guarantee the repayment on a defined schedule, with Brandon's stake in a future advisory arrangement, functioning as the mechanism through which he would fulfill his side of the obligation. The conditions were specific. The timeline was not generous. The language left no room for renegotiation. It was not a gift. It was a door. Brandon read the summary paragraph, then the first tabbed section. Then he stopped and looked out at the skyline for a long moment and then looked back down at the document in his hands. He nodded, slowly, without drama, the way a person nods when they have understood something that they also understand will cost them. "Okay," he said. Just that. One word. I found that I preferred it to anything longer. We stood there for a while, after that neither of us speaking, the document held loosely in his hands. The city, doing what it did in the hour before the lights came on fully, and the evening version of itself took over. The celebration continued behind the glass. Someone inside laughed at something, the sound brief and bright, and then the music absorbed it. It was not the silence of the midnight office. It was not the silence of Brandon's hotel room at 6 a.m, weighted with confession and consequence. This silence was different, lighter, and at the same time more honest, the way air feels after weather has passed through and the pressure has finally equalized. He was not forgiven yet, but he had taken the first step. And sometimes, that is all you can ask of someone. The coffee was always ready by 7:45. That had been Eleanor's contribution to the arrangement. She had discovered sometime in the first month after the IPO that the Monroe FinTech office kept its brewing equipment on a timer, and that if you arrived before 8, you had the place largely to yourself. She had started showing up at 7:50. I had started showing up at 7:48. Neither of us had discussed this directly. It had simply become the shape of Monday mornings. I was at my desk when she arrived, coat still on, 2 cups already poured. She took hers without comment, settled into the chair across from my desk. Not the formal chair, the one slightly to the left that had acquired over the past 6 months the specific quality of a chair that belonged to someone. And we sat in the quiet that exists before a building fully wakes up. "Market opens steady," Eleanor said without looking up from her phone. "It usually does," I said. She made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite disagreement, and we returned to our respective silences. This was, I had come to understand, one of the better things that could happen on a Monday. 6 months was not a long time. It was, however, long enough for certain things to become clear. TerraVault Capital's chief executive had been found responsible on 3 counts of securities fraud in a federal proceeding that concluded 6 weeks after the IPO. The sentencing followed 2 months later, 12 years, with the firm's remaining assets frozen, pending a broader investigation. The news had run for 2 days across the financial networks, then receded into the ongoing coverage of other things. Large stories became medium stories, became archived entries. The people inside them continued living whatever came next. Brandon was living his. His small advisory practice had contracted significantly in the months following his public testimony. Some clients had left. He had not tried to stop them. What he had done steadily and without announcement was work through the repayment schedule in the Monroe FinTech agreement, one installment at a time. Marcus sent me a brief update each month. The payments arrived before the due date. Every one of them. I did not call Brandon to acknowledge this. He did not call me to discuss it. We had spoken twice in 6 months, both conversations short and honest, in a way that longer conversations sometimes were not. The distance between us was not cold. It was the appropriate distance of 2 people who had agreed without saying so, directly, that trust was something built incrementally or not at all. Vivienne was in Atlanta. I knew this, not because I had continued to monitor her, but because the shelter had sent a standard notification 3 months in confirming she was meeting the program's requirements. 1 letter, no further contact requested or offered. She was 58 years old. She had taken a position at a grocery store 4 blocks from the facility, something I learned from a brief line in the shelter's quarterly newsletter, a generic update about residents who had achieved employment milestones. Her name was not in it, but the details matched. I had read that newsletter once, then set it aside. There was nothing in me that knew what to do with the information except leave it where it was. At 9:15, Marcus appeared at the office entrance with a tablet and the particular expression he wore when he had numbers that were good and wanted to present them without seeming pleased about it. "Market cap crossed $2 billion at open," he said. "Holding." "Thank you, Marcus." He nodded and withdrew. Eleanor looked up from her phone and raised her cup slightly. A quiet toast, understated in a way that felt right for a Monday morning in an office that had been through what this one had been through. I raised mine in return. $2 billion. 6 months ago, I had stood on a trading floor and said the words, "a little girl who once stood alone at an airport." The distance between that sentence and this number was in some ways the entire story. In other ways, it was simply the result of work done correctly over a long period of time, the kind that looks like an event from the outside and feels from the inside like the natural consequence of 10,000 smaller decisions. At 10 o'clock, when the office had fully populated and the day had found its rhythm, I opened my phone and navigated to the secure folder that James Okafor's firm had maintained on my behalf for 2 years. 47 pages of reports, photographs, surveillance records, wire transfer summaries, the full architecture of everything I had needed to know before I could move. I deleted the folder. It took 4 seconds. The phone confirmed the deletion with a small notification that disappeared almost immediately. I set the phone face down on the desk and returned to the quarterly projections on my monitor. The past I had decided was most useful when it was finished. It was nearly noon when I reached into the bottom drawer of my desk for a physical contract that predated our document management system, and my hand found something else first. I stopped. The paper had gone the color of old photographs, not quite cream, not quite gray, somewhere between. The printing had faded at the edges, but remained legible at the center. Gate 7, one way, Atlanta to Savannah. A date 24 years ago, in numbers so familiar I had stopped needing to read them to know what they said. I held it for a moment. The office moved around me, keyboards, a phone call down the hall, the ambient sound of a floor full of people doing their work. I placed the ticket back in the drawer, closed it. I was not ready. That was simply the truth of it, without judgment or timeline. Some things did not resolve on a schedule. Some things you carried until you understood in a way that was cellular, rather than intellectual, that you no longer needed to. I was not there yet. That was allowed. I returned to the quarterly projections. Outside, New York continued its Monday. The market held steady. The coffee had gone lukewarm, and I drank it anyway. I do not know what made me open it again. It was not a decision, exactly. Not the kind that comes with deliberation and reasoning and a clear sense of purpose. It was more like the way you reach for something before your mind has finished forming the instruction. One moment I was looking at the quarterly projections on my monitor. The next, my hand was on the drawer handle. I pulled it open. The ticket was where I had left it 20 minutes ago. Cream-colored paper, gone to the color of something much older. Edges soft from decades of being folded and folded again. First by a 9-year-old who did not fully understand what she was holding. And then by no one at all, kept in an envelope, kept in a box, kept in a drawer, moved from city to city, across 24 years of a life being built in the spaces that abandonment left behind. I picked it up, held it the way you hold something when you are finally ready to understand what it weighs. Gate 7, one way, Atlanta to Savannah. The date printed in the center was so familiar it had stopped being a date years ago and had become something closer to a fixed point, the coordinate from which everything else in my life had been measured. Before that date, after that date, the girl I was on one side of it, and everything I had spent 2 decades becoming on the other. I turned it over. The back was blank. It had always been blank. I had checked as a child with the specific logic of someone who believed there might be a message. She had missed an explanation, a set of instructions, something that would make the geometry of that morning add up to sense. There was nothing. There had never been anything. It was a ticket, a document designed for a single purpose, used once, and then kept far longer than it was ever meant to be. I thought about the woman who had handed it to me, not with anger. I had expected the anger to still be there, had assumed it was simply in a different room of me quiet, but present, the way old injuries are quiet until you move wrong. But I stood there in the middle of an ordinary Monday morning in a company I had built from a promise made in an airport, and what I found was not anger. It was something closer to understanding. Not of her choices. I did not need to understand those, and I had stopped requiring that understanding as a condition of my own peace, but of the distance between who someone is and what they are capable of giving. Vivian had been a woman with limits she could not name, and wounds she could not locate, and a capacity for a particular kind of harm that she had perhaps never fully recognized as harm at all. That did not excuse it. It did not make the morning at Gate 7 into anything other than what it was. But it made her human, and I found standing there with the ticket in my hand that I was tired of carrying a human-sized weight as though it were something larger, as though it were the whole of me. The truth was simpler than I had allowed it to be for a long time. She had left. I had stayed. And everything I had built, every decision, every calculated risk, every sleepless night, in every office, in every city, had been built not because of her, and not in spite of her, but entirely independent of her. She had not shaped my ambition. She had only provided its original direction. At some point along the way, without marking the precise moment, I had taken the wheel entirely. That was the story. Not the abandonment, not the IPO, not the wire transfers, or the federal proceedings, or the ticker climbing past 2 billion on a Monday morning in Lower Manhattan. The story was this: a 9-year-old had stood alone at a gate with a ticket in her hand and had decided, in the wordless way that children decide things that turn out to matter forever, that she was going to be all right. She had been right. I walked to the far end of the office, where the small recycling bin sat beside the supply cabinet. I held the ticket over it for a moment, not for ceremony, not for weight, just because my hand paused there before it finished what it had started. Then I let it go. It dropped without sound into the bin and disappeared beneath a handful of papers from the morning's work. That was all. No shift in the light, no particular feeling of closure descending from above. Just the ordinary continuation of a Monday keyboards and a phone call down the hall, and the city outside doing what it always did, indifferent and ongoing and entirely unbothered by the private resolutions of the people inside its buildings. I returned to my desk, looked out the window at the length of Midtown in the early spring light. Here is what I know on the other side of all of it. Family is not the people who are present at the beginning. Family is the people who show up consistently, honestly, at cost to themselves, and stay. Eleanor, who had recognized something in a child at an airport and recognized it again in a boardroom 3 decades later, and had never once asked for acknowledgement of the connection. Marcus, who had built contingency plans for contingency plans and sent 3-line updates that always arrived before they were needed. Brandon, who had made a phone call at 12 years old that he had carried for 24 years and had finally, when it mattered most, made the right call again. These were my people, not by blood, by choice, repeated and sustained and earned. If you have ever been handed a one-way ticket by someone who was supposed to stay, if you have ever stood somewhere alone with a date in your hand and no instructions for what comes after, then you already know the most important thing there is to know about this. You are the one who decides what the ticket means. I looked away from this window and back at my monitor. The quarterly projections were waiting. The market was holding steady. Eleanor's coffee cup was still on the left side of my desk, and I could hear her on a call in the conference room, her voice measured and unhurried, doing what she did. Outside, the city was fully awake now. Monday was underway. For the first time in 24 years, I had nothing left to prepare for. The war was over, not because I destroyed her, but because I had finally stopped carrying her. And that more than any IPO, more than any verdict, more than any one-way ticket, was the real victory.